the name on the list. The staffing sheet came through at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, routed to Nathaniel Voss's inbox by accident. His assistant Priya was out with a sinus infection. Her backup, a 24-year-old named Connor, who smelled faintly of energy drinks and ambition, had forwarded the overnight security approvals to the wrong address. Nathaniel's personal review queue instead of the facility's management portal. By the time Connor realized the mistake and sent a follow-up email, Nathaniel had already opened the attachment. It was a standard document. 12 names, headshots, basic credentials, shift assignments. Nathaniel had not looked at a security staffing sheet in 4 years, possibly longer. He was scanning it with the disengaged attention of a man doing someone else's job and looking for the bottom of the page when his eyes stopped moving. Webb Marcus A. Night shift, main lobby and floors 1 through 15. Start date, Monday. Nathaniel sat very still. The office around him continued at its usual Tuesday pitch. Phones on the trading floor 2 levels down, the low percussion of keyboards, someone laughing in the hallway outside his door. None of it reached him. He was looking at a name that he had spent a considerable amount of energy not thinking about, and finding with some irritation that the 8 years he had put between himself and that name had not done the work he'd assumed they would. Marcus Webb. He pulled up the attached photo. The man in the headshot was 41 now, where he had been 33 in the memory Nathaniel kept returning to against his will. The jaw was the same. The eyes were the same, a particular kind of steady that had always made Nathaniel slightly uncomfortable, as though Marcus were measuring something and had already arrived at a number he wasn't going to share. The hair was shorter now, close-cropped, more gray at the temples than Nathaniel would have expected. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply gotten good at it. Nathaniel closed the attachment. He opened it again. He read the name a second time as though repetition might resolve whatever was happening in his chest into something more manageable than what it currently was. Marcus Webb was applying to be a night shift security guard at Voss Logistics headquarters. In the building that ran on the system Marcus had written, Nathaniel picked up his phone and called facilities management directly. He asked to speak with the hiring coordinator for overnight security. When the woman answered, he said in the careful tone he used when he needed to appear less interested than he was, "The web application, the one for the main lobby night shift. Has he accepted yet?" "Mr. Voss." The coordinator sounded startled. "Yes, sir. We sent the offer letter this morning. Background check cleared yesterday. He's scheduled to start Monday." "Good," Nathaniel said. "Don't change anything." He ended the call and sat for a long moment looking out at the river. It was October, and the water was the color of old pewter, and the wind was doing what Chicago wind does in October, which is to say it was reminding everyone in the city that it was in charge and they were guests. He watched a tour boat push south against the current, white and stubborn, and he thought about a Monday morning 8 years ago when he had arrived at the office at 7:15 to find Marcus's key card on the desk outside his office. No note, no explanation, no answer to any of the 6 calls Nathaniel made before noon. He had been furious then. The fury had softened over time into something more complicated guilt with a hard center, wrapped in enough professional justification to make it livable. He had told himself Marcus had made a choice, that people make choices, that the work had been completed enough that what remained was refinement and implementation, that Nathaniel had simply carried it forward, which was what leaders did, which was what the situation had required. He had told himself these things so many times that on most days he almost believed them. He picked up his pen and signed the routing sheet Connor had left on his desk and tried to return to the quarterly logistics review open on his screen. He managed 4 paragraphs before he gave up, turned his chair to face the window, and spent the next 20 minutes watching the river. Marcus Webb pulled into the parking structure on Wacker Drive at 7:43 on Monday morning, which gave him 17 minutes before his orientation started, and just enough time to find the security office without having to ask anyone for directions. He did not like asking for directions in new buildings. It announced you as someone who did not belong, and he had spent enough of the last 8 years in situations where that was already apparent without adding to it. He had printed the building map the night before. He had ironed his shirt. He had packed Lily's lunch, driven her to school, and kissed her on top of the head while she was still half asleep in the passenger seat, and she had batted his hand away the way 9-year-olds do when they want to pretend they're too old for things they're not actually too old for. "I'll be home before you wake up," he had told her. Night shift, 8 to 6. She would stay with Mrs. Okafor downstairs, who charged $40 a week and made Lily do her homework at the kitchen table before allowing any television. He trusted Mrs. Okafor completely, which was not something he said lightly about anyone. The security office was on the lower level, past the loading dock, in a room that smelled of old coffee and dry erase markers. His supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Ray Kowalski, who looked like he had been doing this since the building was built, handed him a badge, a radio, and a laminated card with emergency protocols, and told him in the manner of a man who had delivered this speech many times and had no remaining investment in whether it landed, that the key principles were visibility, consistency, and de-escalation in that order, and that the night shift was quiet, and that quiet was what they wanted it to stay. "You ex-military?" Ray asked, squinting at his file. "No," Marcus said. "You've got that look." Ray handed him the radio. "Doesn't matter. You seem like a man who can handle boring, and boring is what this job mostly is. The nights it isn't boring, I'll need you to be something other than bored. Can you manage that?" "Yes," Marcus said. Ray nodded, apparently satisfied with the economy of the answer. "Tour at 8, lobby at 9. You'll learn the floors on rounds. Any questions?" Marcus had one question which he did not ask, which was whether the Logistics Operations Center on the 12th floor was still running the same routing framework it had been running for the past several years, or whether they had upgraded since then. He did not ask because there was no version of that question that didn't lead somewhere he was not prepared to go on his first day of work. Instead, he clipped the badge to his shirt and followed Ray into the elevator. The tour covered 12 floors in 40 minutes. Marcus walked 2 paces behind Ray and watched the building the way he watched all spaces he was responsible for, not the surfaces, but the systems. The placement of the cameras, the blind spots, the fire suppression routing along the ceilings, the server access doors on each floor marked with yellow hazard tape, most of them locked with key-card-only entry. He noted which floors had overnight staff and which were empty. He noted the elevator patterns, which ones were programmed to skip floors after 9 p.m. He noted the stairwell on the east side that had a sticky door on the 7th floor landing, the kind that swings back too fast and hits the frame hard enough to be mistaken for a door being forced. He did not notice on the 12th floor when they passed the Logistics Operations Center, and he saw through the glass wall the dashboard running on the center monitor, the real-time routing display, the color-coded nodes, the cascade logic, because there was nothing to notice. He had not looked directly at it. He had looked at the exit sign above the stairwell door to the left of the operations center, and if his step had slowed by half a beat, it was imperceptible. And Ray was already talking about the vending machine on 11 that owed him $1.50. They took the elevator back to the lobby. Marcus assumed his post at the main desk at 9 o'clock exactly on time in the way that was not about punctuality so much as about the specific satisfaction of being where he was supposed to be, when he was supposed to be there, doing the thing he'd said he would do. It was a satisfaction he had learned to find in small things, because for a long time, small things were all there were. Nathaniel saw him on the camera feed at 9:14. He was not supposed to be watching the camera feed. He had a board presentation at 10, and a call with the Seattle Distribution Center at noon, and a lunch with 3 venture capital partners at 1:15 that he was not particularly looking forward to. He was supposed to be reviewing his talking points for the board presentation. Instead, He was sitting at his desk with the security monitor feed open in a small window in the bottom right corner of his screen, watching Marcus Webb stand at the main lobby desk with his hands at his sides and his eyes moving across the room in the unhurried, methodical way of someone who had trained himself to see things as they actually were, rather than as he expected them to be. 8 years. The man looked the same. Older, obviously, but the same in the ways that mattered. The stillness, the particular economy of movement, the way he stood, as though the floor under him was reliable and he had confirmed this personally. Nathaniel remembered standing next to him in the server room at 2 in the morning when the routing framework was still a working theory and a lot of whiteboards, watching Marcus trace a logic path with his finger across 3 screens simultaneously, while explaining something about cascade failure that Nathaniel had understood only partially, but had been too proud to admit. He had been 35 then. He had thought he knew a great deal about logistics architecture. He had known enough to recognize that Marcus knew more. He closed the camera feed. He opened his board presentation. He closed it again. He picked up his phone and called the number for Diana Cheng. "Nathaniel?" Diana said, picking up on the second ring. She always picked up on the second ring, which Nathaniel had always found vaguely aggressive. "What do you need?" "Nothing specific," he said, which was not true. "I wanted to check in on the Chicago hub numbers before the board presentation." Diana walked him through the Chicago numbers in the crisp, organized way she handled all things she was good at. Her job had always been good at her job, which was part of what made the thing he'd been not thinking about for 8 years so difficult to cleanly categorize. She had been good at her job before Marcus left. She was better at her job after. He had always told himself the two things were unrelated. "Is there anything else?" Diana asked when the numbers were done. "No," he said. "Thank you, Diana." He hung up and looked out the window again. The tour boat was gone. A freight barge was moving north, low and slow, almost too heavy for the current. He watched it for a while, then turned back to his desk and opened the board presentation, and this time he stayed with it until the 10 o'clock meeting, though if someone had asked him afterward what the 4th slide was about, he could not have said with certainty. At the end of his first shift at 6:03 in the morning, Marcus walked out through the loading dock entrance into the cold October air and stood for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking up at the building. It was glass and steel and 42 floors of Chicago corporate architecture, the kind of building that looked different at different times of day, severe at noon, almost beautiful at dusk, impersonal and enormous in the early morning gray. He looked at it without any particular expression. Then he walked to his car, drove to Lily's school, and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes until the doors opened at 7:30. She came out wearing her purple backpack and a frown that meant either math homework or a social complication with someone named Jade, both of which were recurring features of 3rd grade. "How was it?" she asked, climbing in. "Fine," he said. "Cold." "Did anything happen?" "Not much." He pulled out of the parking lot. "Mrs. Okafor feed you breakfast?" "Oatmeal," Lily said in the tone of someone reporting a minor injustice. "With raisins." "Raisins are good for you." "Raisins are cheating," she said, and pulled out her library book, and the conversation was over in the way that conversations with 9-year-olds are over suddenly and completely, with no obligation to circle back. He drove home through streets that were just beginning to think about morning, past the taqueria that didn't open until 10 and the laundromat that never seemed to close, and thought about the 12th floor and the dashboard he had not looked at directly, and whether the node clustering on the display was the same as the original schema or whether someone had modified it. He thought about this the way you think about a door you've decided not to open, which is to say, you think about it, and then you think about not thinking about it, and then you think about the door again. He pulled into the parking space behind his building. He sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. Then he got out, locked it, and went upstairs to make coffee. He had not thought about it again by the time he fell asleep. Or at least, that was what he told himself. And on this particular morning, that was close enough. 3 weeks would pass before the building showed him what it remembered. He slept until 2 in the afternoon, which was what the night shift did to your body. It didn't destroy the circadian rhythm so much as relocate it, push it sideways into a parallel version of the day where morning was the middle of the night and afternoon was morning, and you ate dinner at what the rest of the world called lunchtime. He had gotten used to it. He had gotten used to a lot of things over the past 8 years that he would not have predicted getting used to, and the shifted sleep schedule was among the least significant of them. He made eggs and toast and ate standing at the counter, which was a habit Lily disapproved of. "We have a table," she would say with the particular moral authority of a child who has decided that certain domestic standards represent civilization itself. She was right. He ate at the table when she was home. After breakfast, he checked the time and did the mental arithmetic. Lily got out at 3:15. Mrs. Okafor would walk her home. She'd be in the apartment by 3:30. He had an hour. He used it to pay 2 bills, online. Transfer $40 to Mrs. Okafor via the payment app she'd finally agreed to use after he spent 45 minutes walking her through setup, and read most of an article about supply chain bottlenecks in a trade publication he still subscribed to out of some stubborn professional habit he hadn't been able to fully sever. The article was about algorithmic routing optimization in large-scale distribution networks. He read the first 2/3 and then stopped, folded his phone face down on the table, and looked out the window at the alley below, where a pigeon was engaged in some complicated dispute with a plastic bag. He did not finish the article. When Lily came home, she dropped her backpack by the door with a theatrical thud and reported that Jade had been actually fine today, which resolved one mystery, and that there was a science project due in 2 weeks that required a poster board, which created a new one. "What's the project?" he asked. "How something works," she said, heading to the kitchen. "You pick the thing." "You pick it. It's your project." She opened the refrigerator and stared into it with the unfocused gaze of someone looking for something she didn't have a name for. "Can it be something with electricity?" "It can be anything you can explain on a poster board." "Then electricity." She closed the refrigerator. "Or bridges. Can it be bridges?" "Bridges work," he said. She nodded, apparently committing to bridges the way she committed to most decisions quickly and without visible doubt. He envied her that. He had once been a person who made decisions quickly. He had become, over the past 8 years, someone who checked the exits first. He started dinner at 5. Chicken and rice simple, the kind of meal that required just enough attention to keep his hands busy, without demanding enough thought to occupy the part of his mind that was against his better judgment, running a low-level background process about the 12th floor of a glass tower on the Chicago River and the routing logic visible on a monitor through a glass wall. He turned on the news. He turned it off again. He finished the rice. "Dad?" Lily said from the table, where she was drawing a preliminary sketch of what appeared to be a very enthusiastic bridge. "What do you do at night when I'm asleep?" "Walk around," he said. "Make sure everything's okay." "That's it." "That's mostly it." She considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to engineering questions and social mathematics alike. "What if something's wrong?" "Then I figure out what it is and fix it," he said. "And then I go back to walking around." She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to her bridge. He set the plates on the table, sat down across from her, and for a while there was just the sound of dinner forks on plates, the radiator knocking in the corner, the distant sound of the 18 bus making it stop 2 blocks over. And he thought, this is enough. This right here. This is the thing he had organized his entire life around, this particular quiet. And most days he believed it. Most days. Night shift, quiet damage. 3 weeks into the job, Marcus had established himself as the kind of employee that HR departments quietly celebrate and then forget about. No complaints, no incidents, No requests for schedule changes. No personality friction with colleagues. He arrived early, left on time, completed his incident logs without grammatical errors, which Ray had told him was rarer than it should be, and had already fixed 2 things that weren't strictly in his job description. The sticky door on the 7th floor stairwell, which he reported to maintenance with a precise description of the hydraulic pressure issue causing it, and the motion sensor in the loading dock that had been triggering false alarms between 2 and 3 in the morning due to a reflective panel someone had left leaning against the east wall. He had identified the panel issue on his 3rd night during his 1:15 round. He had moved the panel, filed a note, and the false alarms stopped. Ray had mentioned it at the following week's shift briefing, in the way supervisors mention things that please them briefly, without making eye contact, as though extended approval might create an obligation. What Ray did not know, because Marcus had not mentioned it, and because it was not something that appeared in any incident report, was that on his 2nd week, during his 2:30 round on the 12th floor, he had stopped outside the operations center for 3 minutes and 14 seconds and looked through the glass at the dashboard display. He told himself he had stopped because he heard an unusual sound from the HVAC duct above the center's east wall. This was partially true. There was a sound. It was also true that he had stood there longer than the sound required, long enough to read the cascade logic visualization on the center monitor, to trace the node clustering with his eyes the way a person traces a scar, not with pain exactly, more with the dull recognition of something that was once yours and is no longer yours, and is, in fact, very much someone else's now. The framework was his. He could see it in the architecture of the display, the way the priority routing branched, the color assignment for congestion levels, the cluster threshold logic that had taken him 3 months to work out and that he had never written down anywhere except in the code itself and in a set of private files he'd kept on a portable drive. The implementation had been refined. Someone had cleaned it up, streamlined the interface, added a few layers of reporting logic that were competent and functional, and looked nothing like his original approach to the interface layer, which had always been the part he cared about least. The bones were his. The bones were unmistakably his. He had stepped back from the glass, finished his round, and said nothing to anyone. This was, he recognized, consistent with a pattern he had spent 8 years constructing, and had become very good at seeing things clearly and choosing not to act on what he saw. Not because he was a coward, or not only because of that, but because he had learned that action had consequences that extended beyond himself, and he was not in a position to absorb complicated consequences. He had Lily. He had Mrs. Okafor and $40 a week, and a lease that renewed in February, and new school shoes that had cost $63 at the place on South Halsted that did half off on Tuesdays. He had a life that was small in dimension and stable in structure, and he was not interested in destabilizing it. He had gotten his current life by walking away from a previous one. He understood the math. Diana Cheng noticed him on a Thursday afternoon, which was not something she had planned. She was crossing the lobby on her way back from an external meeting. Navy blazer, dark slacks, the brisk walk of a person who managed her time in 15-minute blocks and resented anything that disrupted the grid. She noticed the security guard at the main desk because he was standing in a way that was slightly unusual. Not the slack-spine stand of someone doing a boring job, not the performative alertness of someone who knew they were being watched, but something in between, a genuine, uncontrived attentiveness, the kind that came from actually caring about what you were looking at, rather than performing the appearance of caring. She had seen that posture before in meetings in people who were very good at what they did and knew it without needing to tell anyone. She did not make the connection then. She was thinking about the quarterly review and the Chicago hub discrepancy that had appeared in the morning's numbers, which was 4% off projected throughput and had not yet been satisfactorily explained by anyone in her department. She passed the desk without slowing, took the elevator to 38 and set her bag on her chair and pulled up the hub report. What she noticed reviewing her calendar 20 minutes later was that Nathaniel had asked HR about the new lobby guard twice in the past 2 weeks. She knew this because her assistant Kevin had heard it from Connor, who had heard it from someone in HR, and information traveled through an office building the way water travels through limestone, slowly, invisibly. And then all at once. Kevin had mentioned it in passing, the way he mentioned things he thought she should know, but wasn't sure she'd want to know, with the careful deniability of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. She pulled up the building's HR portal. She ran a search. Webb Marcus A., age 41. Current position, security guard, night shift. Previous positions, a 2-year gap, followed by various contract positions in warehouse operations, followed by another gap, followed by a logistics consulting role that lasted 7 months, followed by several more years of contract and part-time positions, followed by the current role. Before all of that, 8 years ago, an employment record that stopped mid-sentence, like a paragraph cut off before the period. The last entry in the system before the gap read, Senior Systems Architect, Voss Logistics Contract Position, January through September of that year. September. That was when he had disappeared. Diana sat very still for a moment, the way Nathaniel had sat very still 3 weeks earlier in his office on the 42nd floor, and for the same reason, though she would not have admitted the similarity. Then she closed the HR portal and opened a different window, and did not think about Marcus Webb for the rest of the afternoon, which required more effort than she would have liked. Marcus and Lily ate dinner on Tuesday evenings at a diner on Blue Island Avenue called Teresa's, which had been there since what the owner, a compact Polish-American woman in her 60s named Anna Teresa, described as, "before your daughter's grandfather was born, probably." It had red vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed significantly since the 90s, and coffee that came in a white ceramic mug automatically without asking, which Marcus appreciated. He appreciated not having to ask for things. Lily always ordered the pancakes regardless of the time of day, because Teresa's served breakfast all day, and Lily considered this the most civilized possible policy. Marcus ordered the club sandwich. They had been coming here for 2 years, since they moved to Pilsen from the apartment in Logan Square that had become too expensive after his second contract ended. "Tell me 3 things," he said, which was their standing Tuesday ritual. 3 things from the week, any category, any size. Lily held up one finger. "We started the bridge unit in science, so the poster board is perfect timing." "That's good planning," he said. She held up a second finger. "Jade apologized about what she said about my coat." "How was that?" "Weird," Lily said with the honesty of someone who was working out social complexity in real time. "But okay weird. Not bad weird." She held up a third finger. "Mrs. Okafor taught me how to make jollof rice." "Yeah?" "She says I have good instincts." Lily said this with quiet pride, the kind that lives in the chest and doesn't need to announce itself. "She says instincts are more important than recipes." "Mrs. Okafor is right," Marcus said. Lily looked at him across the booth with the direct, assessing gaze she'd had since she was old enough to look directly at things. "Your turn," she said. He thought about it. He tried to give her 3 things that were true without being heavy. "I learned the whole building I work in," he said. "I know where everything is now." "That's 1. "The sticky door on the 7th floor is fixed. I figured out what was wrong with it." "That's 2. He thought about the 3rd. "Your Mrs. Okafor is right about instincts," he said finally. "I've been thinking about that a lot this week." Lily tilted her head. It was a gesture she'd had since she was small. A kind of physical question mark, angled right. "Because of the building?" "A little bit." She seemed to consider pressing further and then decided against it, which was another thing she'd learned early. When her father said, "a little bit," it meant there was more, and that more was not for right now, and that right now was still okay. She went back to her pancakes. He watched her eat and thought about instincts and about the routing display on the 12th floor and about the particular quality of not acting that he had practiced so long it felt like a personality trait, and whether there was a difference between patience and avoidance when they looked the same from the outside and felt different from the inside. He drank his coffee and did not resolve the question, and paid the bill and drove them home through the October dark, the city lights smearing orange across the wet windshield. On the 19th day of his employment, Marcus was doing his 2:30 round on the 11th floor when he heard Diana Chang's voice through the partially open door of a conference room. She was on the phone. He was not listening. He was noting the emergency lighting test indicator that had not been reset after last week's quarterly drill. But he caught two words before he moved on down the corridor. Two words in the particular tone of someone delivering a verdict rather than sharing information. The words were his name. He did not slow his step. He did not look toward the conference room door. He reached the end of the corridor, turned left at the stairwell, and climbed to 12 and stood outside the operations center for one moment with his hand on the stairwell door, and then pushed through and began his round. What he was not aware of as he walked the 12th floor with his radio on his hip and his badge on his chest was that Diana Chang had ended her call 60 seconds earlier, put her phone on the conference room table, and was sitting in the dark with her hands flat on the surface and her jaw set against something that was not quite anger and was not quite fear, and was in fact very precisely the combination of both that you arrive at when you realize that something you thought was safely behind you has just walked through the front door of the building where you work. She had spent 19 days not thinking about Marcus Webb. She had 19 days of not thinking to make up for. 2 in the morning. The system went down at 2:17 on a Friday morning in late October, 8 seconds after Marcus had completed his round on the 11th floor and was walking the stairwell to 12. He knew something was wrong before the alarm started. There was a sound, not a loud sound, more an absence of sound. The particular silence that happens when a server array that has been producing a constant low-frequency hum at the edge of hearing suddenly does not. He had worked in enough data-adjacent spaces to know the difference between a building being quiet and a building holding its breath. He took the stairwell door and moved down the corridor toward the operations center at a pace that was not running, but was not walking either. And the alarm, a soft interior alert, not the fire system, not the security breach tone, but the red light pulse of a critical operations failure, was already cycling on the panel above the center's glass wall by the time he reached it. Through the glass, he could see 3 monitors in a cascade of error states. The main routing display, the one he had spent 19 days carefully not looking at, was showing a cascading red pattern that his eye parsed instantly, automatically, the way a musician reads sheet music, not as data to be decoded, but as information that arrived already understood. The priority node cluster for the Chicago-Detroit corridor had hit a conflict threshold and defaulted to a null routing state. The system was trying to recover and looping on the same decision fork, which meant it would keep looping until someone intervened. He clipped his radio. "Ray, this is Marcus at 12. Ops Center is showing a critical routing failure. I'm going to need access to assess." Ray's voice came back immediately, thick with the particular alertness of someone who had been awake but not all the way awake. "Copy that. I'm pulling up the camera now. You have keycard access to Ops. It's on your authorization. Go in. Don't touch anything on the servers themselves." He pushed through the glass door. The room was cold, server rooms always were, and smelled of metal and the faint plastic warmth of running equipment. The main display was cycling through the error state in 30-second intervals. Cascade attempt, null. Reset, cascade again. He stood in front of it for 4 seconds, just looking, in the way he had stood in front of the glass wall 19 days ago, not as a stranger, not as someone encountering this for the first time, but as someone who was seeing a face they had looked at before, in a different context, in a different life. Then he sat down at the operator terminal. The keyboard was standard. The interface had been redesigned. The surface was different. The skin was different. The reporting windows were positioned differently than he would have put them. But the architecture underneath responded to his inputs the way it always had, because the architecture underneath was his and had not been changed in any fundamental way, because you do not change the fundamental architecture of something that works. You dress it up. You give it a new face. The bones stay. He moved through the system with the methodical speed of someone who is not uncertain and has no need to perform certainty. He found the conflict fork it was in the priority waiting for time-sensitive freight when two corridors hit simultaneous congestion, a scenario that the original framework had handled with a specific bypass protocol that someone somewhere in the last 8 years of refinement had quietly disabled, probably to reduce response latency on routine routing. Not realizing that the bypass protocol wasn't for routine routing, he re-enabled it. He ran a manual override on the current conflict state. He watched the cascade stop. The recovery took 4 minutes. At 2:23, the main display shifted from red to yellow. At 2:26, it shifted to green. The routing resumed. The system breathed. He sat back in the chair and looked at the screen, and did not allow himself to feel anything in particular about any of this, because feeling things about it would require him to acknowledge a set of implications that he had been declining to acknowledge for 19 days, and was not ready to acknowledge now at 2:26 in the morning, in a cold server room on the 12th floor of a building. He was being paid $11 above minimum wage to keep safe from unauthorized entry. He filed an incident report before he left the room. He noted the technical nature of the failure in general terms: critical routing conflict, manual override performed, system restored, and did not note the specific method or the specifics of what he had recognized in the system's architecture. He noted the time of incident and the time of resolution, and his employee ID, and signed it, Marcus A. Webb, and went back to his round. At 2:41, the IT on-call team arrived. 2 men, early 30s, one of them still in a jacket he'd clearly grabbed off a chair rather than a hanger. They pushed into the operations center, pulled up the logs, and spent 11 minutes determining that the system had in fact recovered, which it had, and that the incident had been resolved, which it had, and that the resolution had been executed from the operator terminal, which was logged, along with the specific terminal ID and the badge swipe that had initiated access. Marcus Webb, security guard. The one in the haphazardly jacketed state pulled up the command log. "That's," he said, and stopped. His colleague leaned over. "Read it. That's not a standard override." "No," said the first one. They looked at each other. "That's the original bypass protocol," said the colleague very carefully, in the way you say something carefully when you're not sure of the implications, but you are fairly sure they are significant. "Nobody's touched that in years. I didn't even know where it was." They filed their own incident report. They noted the command sequence. They went home. Their report landed in Diana Cheng's email at 7:14 on Friday morning. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly. Then she called her assistant Kevin and told him to hold her 9 o'clock and close her door. She sat alone in her office on the 38th floor with the incident report on one screen and Marcus Webb's HR file on the other, and for a long time, she did not do anything except look at both of them in turn, the way you look at two documents you had hoped would never appear side by side. The bypass protocol. She knew exactly what that protocol was and where it had come from, because she had been there in the original version of the framework, had read it line by line when she'd inherited the project management after Marcus disappeared, had made the decision 3 years later to disable it in the optimization pass because the latency issue was real and she had not fully understood what the protocol was protecting against. She had thought it was a redundancy. She had been wrong. She had discovered she was wrong quietly, at a time when discovering it publicly would have been costly, and had made the decision not to revisit it. That decision was now logged in a system incident report alongside the badge number of the man who had written the protocol in the first place. She picked up her phone. She called Nathaniel. "Nathaniel," she said when he picked up. "Diana." His voice was careful. "What is it?" We had a routing failure last night. 12th-floor Ops Center, Chicago-Detroit corridor. It's been resolved. A pause that was half a second too long to be comfortable. When? 2:17, restored by 2:26. Who resolved it? She looked at the incident report. The night security guard identified the failure and performed a manual override while IT was en route. Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus Webb, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Silence. She could hear him breathing, which she almost never could on a call, which meant something. Don't do anything yet, he said. She looked out her window at the city, which was doing what Chicago cities do on October mornings, being gray and enormous, and not particularly interested in anyone's problems. Nathaniel, she said with the careful precision of someone navigating a very specific minefield. I think we need to be proactive about how this is handled. I said, don't do anything yet. His voice had a quality she recognized, the flatness that meant he was not discussing, he was deciding. She had heard it in board meetings, in negotiations, in the particular silence before he told someone their proposal wasn't going to work. She had never heard it directed at her before. All right, she said. She ended the call. She looked at the incident report. She looked at the HR file. She opened a third window and pulled up the building's server access archive, the record of every keycard swipe on every restricted door for the past calendar year. She searched for the 12th floor operations center. She went back 30 days. She found Marcus's swipe from 2:17 that morning, and she found before that 2 other swipes she had not known about. One on day 14 of his employment at 2:33 a.m., lasting 3 minutes and 14 seconds. One on day 2 at 2:41 a.m., lasting 47 seconds. He had been in the operations center before. He had not touched anything those times. The system logs showed no terminal activity on either date. He had just been in the room. She closed the archive. She looked at the city again. Then she did something that Nathaniel had specifically told her not to do. She opened a new email, addressed it to HR, and began to type. What the drive remembers. Marcus received the termination notice at 11:52 on a Friday evening via the HR notification system in an email with the subject line, "Important notice regarding your employment status." He was sitting in his car in the parking structure across from the building 20 minutes early for his shift, eating a protein bar and listening to a podcast about bridge engineering that Lily had recommended on the grounds that it was, "Actually interesting, Dad, I promise." He had agreed with her assessment. It was actually interesting. He read the email once. Unauthorized access to protected systems, effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and equipment to the security desk. He read it again. Then he closed his email, finished the protein bar, folded the wrapper into a precise square, and put it in the cup holder. He looked at the steering wheel for a moment. The podcast was still playing. A structural engineer was explaining the particular problem of resonant frequency in suspension bridges, the way a structure can be technically sound and still fail if the wrong vibration finds the right frequency. He turned it off. Lily was asleep at Mrs. Okafor's. He'd kissed her goodbye at 8:15, same as every Friday. She'd been awake enough to say, "Don't let anything happen to the building, Dad," which was what she said on Fridays when she was in a good mood, and he'd said, "I'll do my best," which was what he always said back. He got out of the car. He walked to the building entrance. The overnight front desk coordinator, a young woman named Sasha, who had never been anything but professional to him, handed him an envelope when he came in. Her eyes carefully neutral, in the way people's eyes get when they have been told to deliver something and know it is not good. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You don't have anything to be sorry about," he said, and meant it. He surrendered his badge and his radio and signed the acknowledgement form that HR required, and walked back out into the cold. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The Chicago River was 2 blocks east, and he could smell it. Water and metal, and the specific cold that comes off moving water in late October. He took out his phone and photographed the termination email. Then he walked back to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and thought about what to do. He did not call anyone. There was no one to call. His sister in Detroit was 3 hours behind on a phone call he owed her from 2 weeks ago. His former colleague from his consulting days, a man named Phil Hutchins, who occasionally sent him job postings, would be asleep. He could call a lawyer, but it was 11:52 on a Friday, and he did not have a lawyer. He sat in the car and thought about Lily and new school shoes and Mrs. Okafor's $40 a week and the lease that renewed in February. He thought about these things not with panic, but with the methodical weight of a man who has had to calculate his resources before, who has sat in quiet cars in parking structures before and worked out what the actual situation was versus what it felt like, and found a gap between them, and decided to live in the gap. The actual situation he had been fired for, unauthorized access to a system he had written. He had no legal claim of record because he had left the original contract before signing the final intellectual property agreement, which he had been told at the time was a formality to complete later, and which had never been completed because there had been no later. He had no witnesses. He had one photograph of a termination email and a memory of 11 minutes of work on a Friday morning in a cold server room. The other situation underneath that he was 41 years old and he was tired in a way that was not about sleep. He started the car. He drove home. The flash drive was found on a Saturday morning by an IT technician named James Okonkwo, who was working a weekend shift to complete the server rack replacement that had been scheduled for 3 weeks and kept getting pushed. It was plugged into a port on the back of the old rack, the original rack, the one that had been there since the system was first installed, that no one had touched in years because it was the original rack. And you did not touch the original rack because the original rack was what everything ran on, except that now they were replacing it because the equipment was 8 years old, and the company had finally authorized the capital expenditure for new hardware. And James Okonkwo had unplugged 17 different cables and peripherals and was working his way around the back of the unit when his hand found something in the dust behind the third bay. A portable drive no bigger than a thumb, black. No label on the outside. He held it up to the light, turned it over, and plugged it into his laptop because that was what you did when you found a drive in a server room and it wasn't labeled as destroyed. The drive contained one folder. The folder was named web_original_framework_v1. Inside the folder, 214 files. Source code documented in the detailed, slightly obsessive style of someone who documented not for other people, but for the version of themselves that might need to understand this again in 6 months. Design documents, architecture diagrams, email threads exported and saved dated across a 6-month period 8 years ago. And at the top of the folder, in a file simply named read_me, a single paragraph. This is the original framework for the VOS logistics routing system. If you're reading this, something has changed, and I'm not here to explain it. The bypass protocol in the priority waiting module is not a redundancy. Do not disable it. The cascade failure threshold is calibrated to the Chicago hub's peak throughput. This framework belongs to Marcus Webb. The contract was never finalized. That matters. James Okonkwo read this twice. Then he called his supervisor, who told him to leave the drive where it was and not touch anything, which was a strange thing to say since he had already touched quite a lot and that someone would be in on Monday. Diana Cheng was there in 40 minutes. She had been at a Saturday morning yoga class when the call came from James's supervisor, who reported to her indirectly through facilities and had learned over time that Diana Cheng wanted to know about things. She arrived in workout clothes, which James had never seen her in, and which seemed to make her, if anything, more formidable. She took the drive from his laptop without asking. She read the read_me file. She said thank you in a way that meant the conversation was over, and left. She read the full contents of the drive in her car in the parking structure. Not all of it there was too much to read in a car on a Saturday morning, but enough. The source code, the design documents, the email threads, which included in their archived chain 3 emails from her own account from 8 years ago, sent during the 6 months Marcus had been on contract, in which she discussed the framework in terms that made it very clear she understood whose work it was and what it represented. Those 3 emails were the problem. Not because she had said anything explicitly wrong in them, but because they existed. And because they were time-stamped 8 years ago, and because when you read them alongside the read_me file and alongside the past 8 years of her career trajectory, the story they told was not the story she had ever told anyone else. She had not stolen anything. She had been very careful over 8 years to never be in a position where it could be called theft. She had taken over the management of an abandoned project, delivered it, implemented it, improved it, and built a career on the implementation. Every step had been defensible. The ethics of it had lived in the gap between defensible and right, in the particular gray zone where people who are smart and ambitious and also somewhat afraid tend to operate. She had been afraid. She still was. She was afraid in the specific way of someone who has built something real on top of an original injustice and spent so long improving the building that they have sometimes almost forgotten what's in the foundation. She made a decision. It was not the right decision, and part of her knew that, but it was the decision that her fear arrived at after 40 minutes in a parking structure on a Saturday morning, and fear is not a good strategist. She called Marcus. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She heard the ambient sound of an apartment, a television somewhere, the low register of a voice that might be a child's. "Mr. Webb," she said, "this is Diana Cheng, VP of Operations at Voss Logistics." A pause. When he spoke, his voice was the same as she'd heard through the conference room door 3 weeks ago, even undemonstrative. "Miss Cheng, I'd like to meet with you on Monday morning," she said. Informally. "There are some administrative matters related to your termination that I want to discuss in person." "My termination was effective immediately," he said. "I've already returned my badge." "I'm aware. This is a separate conversation." Another pause. She heard what might have been a chair being pushed back. "What kind of conversation?" She chose her words with care, the way she chose all words in negotiation, for what they implied rather than what they said. One that might be beneficial to both parties. There are circumstances around your departure that could be interpreted in more than one way, and I think a direct conversation would serve everyone's interests. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not louder, not more aggressive, but different in quality, the way still water is different from water that has registered something moving through it. "I found the framework, Miss Cheng." She said nothing. "I saw it on the display," he said. 3 weeks ago. I knew what it was." A pause. "I didn't come here looking for it. I came here because I needed a job." "I know," she said, and meant it. "Then you know that whatever you want to discuss on Monday, I'm not interested in doing it informally. If you want to talk to me about this, I want it documented." She looked at the drive in her hand. "I think," she said slowly, "that documentation might be more complicated than you realize, for both of us." "Maybe," he said, "but I've been on the complicated end of this before, and it was a lot more complicated for me than it was for anyone else. So if that's the approach, I'll take my chances." A long silence. Outside her car window, another car was pulling into the structure, headlights sweeping across the concrete ceiling. "I'm going to reach out to your personal email on Monday," she said. "Please consider meeting with me." "I'll consider it," he said, and ended the call. She sent the email Monday morning. He did not reply. On Monday afternoon, she did something she had told herself she was not going to do. She pulled up the formal HR system, found Marcus's separation file, and added a notation: pending administrative review. Access restriction confirmed. Do not rehire. Then she forwarded the separation notice to the building's general contractor security system, which automatically flagged his name in the building access database, which meant that when he presented himself at the lobby on Monday evening, which she had assessed based on the kind of person she now understood him to be, as a thing he would not do, he would not be able to enter. She was right that he didn't try to re-enter the building. She did not account for what Nathaniel was doing on Monday evening. Nathaniel Voss had read James Okonkwo's incident email forwarded to him by the facilities supervisor at 9:43 on Monday morning. He had read the read_me file which James had copied into the body of his report. He had sat at his desk for 6 minutes without moving. Then he had called down to IT and asked them very specifically where the drive was. He was told Diana Cheng had collected it on Saturday. He called Diana's direct line. She did not pick up. He called again. She did not pick up. He sent an email marked urgent. She responded 40 minutes later with a note that said, "In back-to-back meetings, we'll call this afternoon. Nothing to worry about. Flash drive is with me for safekeeping." He looked at that response for a while. Then he called the head of IT security directly and asked for the server log from the drive's discovery, which showed the timestamp of James's access and what the drive contained. He asked for a copy of the drive contents to be sent to his private account. IT security told him the drive had been collected by Diana Cheng before any backup was made. He put the phone down on his desk. He looked at it. Then he picked it up again and called the building's security desk. "This is Nathaniel Voss," he said. "I need the home address on file for a former employee, Marcus Webb, night security shift. Can you pull that?" The desk coordinator pulled it. He wrote down the address. He looked at it for a moment. Then he told his assistant to clear his Tuesday morning, got his coat from the rack behind the door, and left the building at 4:45, which was 3 hours earlier than he usually left. On his way out through the lobby, he passed the main security desk where Marcus had stood for 3 weeks. He stood there for a second and looked at the desk, at the empty chair, at the security logbook, open to a page of Marcus's handwriting, neat, angular. The handwriting of someone who had been taught to write precisely and had never unlearned it. He went out into the October evening. In his office on the 38th floor, Diana Cheng sat at her desk with the flash drive in her top drawer and Nathaniel's unanswered calls in her recent log, and thought about what it meant that she could not pick up the phone and what it meant that she still hadn't. The weight of a name. Nathaniel arrived at Diana Cheng's office at 7:58 on Tuesday morning before she was there. He sat in the chair across from her desk and waited. He had asked Kevin, her assistant, to let him in, and Kevin had done so with the careful expression of someone who has learned that when Nathaniel Voss asks for something in that particular tone of voice, the correct response is not a question. When Diana walked in at 8:03, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at him. She looked at the chair he was sitting in, which was her guest chair, which no one sat in without being invited, as a general principle of how her office worked. Then she came in, set her bag on the credenza, and sat down across from him. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He placed the flash drive on the desk between them. Or rather, a flash drive, an identical one, a copy, because he had called James Okonkwo on Monday evening directly and asked him to reconstruct from memory what files he had seen before Diana took the drive. And James had been thorough enough to have opened several of them before the call came to stop touching things, and had described them in enough detail for Nathaniel to have IT security work through the weekend to reconstruct the index from the temporary cache on James's laptop. It was not the original drive. It had enough of the contents to make the point. "How long have you had it?" he said. Diana looked at the drive. She looked at him. She made the calculation that he could see her making, the one where you assess how much someone knows and how much they're inferring and whether there's a gap to work with. She concluded correctly that the gap was very small. "Saturday morning," she said. James found it Saturday morning. When did you decide to collect it before it was logged? Nathaniel. Her voice was precise and cool, which was her default register for difficult conversations. The voice that meant she was managing rather than responding. I understand you're concerned, but there are significant legal and reputational implications to how this is handled. If you think that flash drive represents a liability, I agree with you. And I would argue that the appropriate response is to manage the liability carefully, not to. Diana? His voice was quiet in the way that his voice got quiet when he was not going to say something twice. He fixed the system in 11 minutes, without being asked, without telling anyone. He drove home afterward and didn't say a word. She said nothing. He applied for a security guard job, Nathaniel said, because he needed the income, not because he was trying to find the framework, not because he had some plan. He needed the income, and this building was hiring, and he showed up and did the job and fixed a critical failure in the middle of the night and filed an incident report and went home. He stopped. And you fired him. I followed procedure, Diana said. The unauthorized access policy is, he wrote the system, Nathaniel said. The words sat in the room between them. Diana looked at the drive. She looked at her hands, which were flat on the desk in the particular controlled stillness of someone who is not going to give anything away. Then she said very quietly, "We both know that contract was never finalized." "We both know why it wasn't finalized," he said. She looked up. He left. He chose to leave. His wife was dying, Nathaniel said. He left to be with his wife, and then she didn't make it. And then he had a newborn, and then... He stopped himself, breathed. He didn't choose to leave the way we're talking about it. He left because his life was falling apart, and he came back to it 8 years later, and the first thing that happened to him is that you fired him for fixing his own work. Diana's jaw tightened very slightly. What are you planning to do? Coordinated. I'm planning to go to his address in Pilsen and tell him what we have and what I intend to do about it. Then I'm calling an emergency board session for Thursday and telling them the same thing. Origin of the routing framework, the intellectual property history, and what we owe him. The IPO will be delayed, he said. 3 weeks probably, maybe 4. The board won't. I know what the board will do, he said. I've been thinking about what the board will do for the last 5 days. I'm going to do this anyway. He stood up. He picked up the drive. He looked at her not with anger, which was what she'd expected, but with something more difficult than anger, which was disappointment of the specific kind that comes from a long time. I want your resignation on my desk by end of day Thursday. If it isn't there, we'll have a different conversation. Diana looked at him. Her expression did not change. What he saw in it, and he had worked with her for 6 years and understood her the way you understand someone you've spent 6 years watching navigate very difficult rooms, was not defiance. It was something he hadn't expected, a kind of exhausted, complicated relief, as though a door she had been holding shut for 8 years had just been opened by someone else, and the opening, though it was the end of something, was also the end of holding the door. All right, she said. He left. The address in Pilsen was a 3-story walk-up on a block with the mural of a hawk taking flight painted on the side of the building at the corner, enormous in oranges and golds. The kind of thing that made you look up when you drove past. Nathaniel parked across the street and looked at it for a moment before getting out of the car. He found the buzzer panel by the front door, found the unit that matched the number he'd written down, and pressed it. Silence. Then the intercom crackled. Who is it? A child's voice, a girl's, high and clear. He hesitated. My name is Nathaniel. I'm looking for Marcus Webb. I used to work with him. A pause. The intercom crackled again. Dad, someone for you. He heard through the intercom a muffled exchange, then the intercom clicked off, and then the door buzzed open. He climbed 2 flights of stairs. The door to the unit was already open by the time he got there, and Marcus Webb was standing in it in jeans and a gray pullover, with his arms at his sides and an expression that Nathaniel, who had been rehearsing this moment in some form for 5 days, had not fully anticipated. It was not anger. It was not surprise, which meant he had either expected this or had decided at some level that things were moving, and this was what moving things looked like. What it was mostly was tired. And within the tired, something else, something held very carefully back. "Nathaniel," Marcus said. Not Mr. Voss, not the formal version. Just the name, flat and level. The way you say the name of someone you used to know. "Marcus," he said. They looked at each other across the threshold. 8 years was not enough time for the features to be unrecognizable, just enough time for everything to be older, which was its own kind of information. "How did you get this address?" Marcus asked. "From the building's HR file. I asked for it on Monday." Marcus nodded as though this answered a question he'd already worked most of the way through. "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The apartment was small and clean and organized in the particular way of someone who has learned to make the most of limited space. Bookshelves that went floor to ceiling on one wall, a kitchen table with a homework project spread across it, a poster board half covered in pencil drawings of bridge structures, a couch with a throw blanket folded over the back of it. A girl of about 9 was sitting on the couch with her arms crossed, looking at Nathaniel with the direct assessment of someone who has decided that this was her living room, and she was entitled to have opinions about who was in it. "Lily," Marcus said, "can you give us a few minutes? You can finish the bridge in your room." She looked at Nathaniel for another second. Then she gathered the poster board and a cup of pencils with the efficiency of someone executing a tactical withdrawal and disappeared down a short hallway. The door closed with a precise click. "She doesn't do anything halfway," Nathaniel said. "No," Marcus said. "She doesn't." He didn't smile, but something shifted slightly at the corner of his mouth. He gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit down." They sat on opposite sides. Between them, the cleared table, a half-drunk glass of water. The particular silence of a space where 2 people are about to say things that have been waiting 8 years to be said. "I know about the drive," Marcus said. "James Okonkwo told you?" "No. Diana called me Saturday night. She made what I would describe as an oblique offer that I turned down." He looked at Nathaniel. "I didn't know what was on the drive specifically, but I knew what it probably was." "She collected it before it was backed up," Nathaniel said. "She's had it since Saturday morning. I had a copy reconstructed from James's cache." Marcus absorbed this without visible reaction the way he absorbed most things. "What does the copy show?" "The original framework, your design documentation, your read_me file, exported email threads from the project period." He paused. "Including emails from Diana that show she understood the attribution." Marcus looked at the table. He picked up the glass of water and put it down without drinking from it. "The contract was never finalized," he said. "I know that. I knew it when I left. I didn't think about it for about 2 years because I wasn't thinking about anything very much for the first 2 years." "I know," Nathaniel said. "Then when I started thinking about it again, it felt too late. And I had—" He stopped, looked at the hallway. "I had other priorities." "I know," Nathaniel said again. Marcus looked at him then directly, the way he looked at things with a particular quality of gaze that had always made Nathaniel feel slightly examined. "What are you planning to do?" Nathaniel told him the board session, the public acknowledgement of the framework's origin, the proposed settlement for intellectual property rights, the delay to the IPO, Diana's resignation. He said it plainly without framing it as generosity or heroism, because it was neither. It was a correction years overdue, and he was aware of that. When he finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I don't want anything from you," he said. His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of someone stating a position that had been carefully considered. "That's not why I applied for the job. I needed the income, and this was the listing." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I know that. I'm not offering you something because I think you came looking for it. I'm offering you something because it's yours, and it's been mine in the public record for 8 years, and that's wrong. And I've known it was wrong, and I've been—" He stopped. "I've been not looking at it," he said, "in the same way you've been not looking at the 12th floor." Marcus was quiet again. The radiator knocked in the corner. From down the hallway came the faint sound of pencil on paper. "What does Diana say?" Marcus asked. "I gave her until Thursday to resign." "She'll do it?" "Yes," he said. "I think she wants to." Marcus considered this. "The IPO. 3 to 4 weeks delayed. The board is going to be difficult. I've accepted that." He looked at Marcus. "I'm not asking you to feel responsible for that." "I don't," Marcus said in a tone that made it clear this was simply a fact and not a performance of not caring. Then, after a pause, "What's the offer specifically?" Merce. "Formal attribution of the framework in the company's IP record. A retroactive licensing agreement for the past 8 years of commercial use. We've had legal draft a number it's significant. And a standing consulting contract, independent, no strings, for as long as you want it. Not on site, not night shift." He said the last 2 words without inflection, but something in how he said them acknowledged the thing they were both aware of. The gap between where Marcus had been and where he should have been, and the 8 years between those 2 places. Marcus put the glass of water down again. He looked at his hands on the table, then out the window at the alley below, where afternoon light was doing its best against an October sky. Then he looked back at Nathaniel. "I'm not saying yes or no today," he said. "I didn't expect you to." "Come back Thursday," Marcus said. "I'll have a lawyer present, someone I trust, not someone you recommend." "Of course," Nathaniel said. He started to push back from the table and then stopped. He had one question. He had carried it for 8 years through every quarterly review and every board presentation, and every morning he'd looked at the routing display in the operations center and thought for just a second about a 6-month period that was also the foundation of everything he'd built. He had not meant to ask it today. He asked it anyway. "Why didn't you call?" he said. "When you left. You left a key card on the desk and walked out. And I called you 6 times, and you never—" Marcus looked at him. "My wife died on the Thursday," he said. "I dropped the key card on Friday because I didn't know what else to do with it. I was going to call." He stopped. "Then I stopped thinking I was going to call. Then enough time went by that it felt like a wall." He was quiet for a second. "I'm not saying that makes sense." "It makes sense," Nathaniel said. And it did. It made the particular kind of sense that comes from understanding something at last, not because it's simple, but because you finally stood close enough to see its actual shape. He stood. Marcus stood. They did not shake hands. It wasn't quite that. Not yet. But Marcus walked him to the door and held it open, and Nathaniel went out into the hallway. And just before the door closed, Lily's voice came from somewhere down the hallway, inside. "Is everything okay, Dad?" And Marcus's voice behind the closing door. "Yeah. Getting there." The board meeting was on Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. 12 people around a table on the 42nd floor with a view of the river that turned gray and silver in the November light, and Nathaniel Voss at the head of it with a folder and the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it regardless of what happens next. He told them everything: the framework, the attribution, the gap in the IP record, the proposed settlement, The IPO delay. Diana's resignation, which had arrived that morning as promised in a letter that said only, "In the interest of the company's long-term credibility, I believe this transition is appropriate. I have ensured that all operational documentation is current and accessible. D. Chang." When Nathaniel finished, the room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where expensive lawyers are present and are calculating simultaneously. Then, a board member named Raymond Park, who had been with the company since its second funding round and who Nathaniel respected for his precise, unromantic understanding of risk, said, "The IPO delay is a problem." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "The optics of publicly acknowledging that the core framework was not originally company property." "They're complicated," Nathaniel said. "But the alternative is that someone else establishes this in court at a less convenient time, which I believe is the direction we were heading." "You believe," said a woman named Carol Finch from the end of the table. "Or you know." "I know," he said. "The drive contains enough documentation to establish a very clear claim. The question was never whether Marcus Webb could prove attribution. The question was whether he would." He paused. "He's a single father in a two-bedroom apartment in Pilsen who took a night shift security job because it was the shift that fit around his daughter's school schedule. He is not a litigious person. He is a person who walked away from things when they got complicated." He stopped. "But he's also a person who fixed our system failure in 11 minutes in the middle of the night without being asked, and went home without saying a word about it. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about who we're dealing with." Raymond Park looked at his folder. "And you want to compensate him regardless." "I want to correct the record," Nathaniel said. "There's a difference." Another board member, whose name was Thomas Greco and who had the expression of a man doing very rapid arithmetic, said, "The settlement figure." Nathaniel named it. 3 people wrote something on their notepads simultaneously. Raymond Park looked up. "That's significant," Park said. "It reflects 8 years of commercial use," Nathaniel said, "at a rate that is still below what we would have paid for a market-rate licensing agreement at the time." A long silence. The river beyond the window moved south, carrying its freight and its October cold indifferent to the arithmetic happening 42 floors above it. "You've already decided," Carol Finch said. It was not a question. It was the observation of a woman who had been on enough boards to know the difference between a presentation seeking input and a presentation announcing a fait accompli. "Yes," Nathaniel said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a note on her pad. "Then let's talk about the communications strategy for the delay announcement," she said, which was her way of accepting the decision and was the most he had hoped for. The meeting ran 2 hours and 14 minutes. At 4:27, Nathaniel walked out of the conference room and stood in the corridor and let out a long breath that he'd been keeping very controlled for 2 hours and 14 minutes. His assistant Priya, who was back from her sinus infection and had been waiting outside with a tablet and 3 message slips, looked at him once and handed him a cup of coffee. "How'd it go?" she asked. "It went," he said. "The IPO announcement is drafted," she said. 3-week delay, pending review." "Good," he said. "Send it." He picked up his coat from her arm. "I'm leaving at 5 today." Priya noted this with the slightly elevated eyebrows of someone for whom his leaving at 5 was a statistical anomaly. "Of course." He took the elevator down. The meeting on Thursday morning had gone differently than either of them expected. Which was to say, it had gone better. Marcus's lawyer was a woman named Sandra Park, no relation to the board member who practiced out of a firm in Wicker Park and who had a reputation, according to the 3 people Marcus had asked about her in the preceding 48 hours, for being extremely good and not interested in games. She had read the preliminary settlement documents the night before and had arrived with 12 specific questions which she asked in order without preamble. Over the course of the first 40 minutes of the meeting, Nathaniel's general counsel answered 11 of them directly, The 12th required a revision to the licensing agreement's territory clause, which General Counsel agreed to on the spot. Marcus said almost nothing during this portion. He sat to Sandra's right with his jacket on and his hands on the table, and listened to other people negotiate on his behalf with the focused attention of someone who is following along rather than checking out, and who has decided that Sandra Park knows what she's doing, and the appropriate thing to do when someone who knows what they're doing is to not get in the way. At the end of the meeting, Sandra said, "Mr. Webb will need 48 hours to review the revised territory clause before signing." "Of course," Nathaniel said. The lawyers filed out. General Counsel Sandra Park, 2 associates. The door closed, and Nathaniel and Marcus were left in the conference room with a cleared table and 2 remaining cups of coffee, one of which Marcus had drunk half of, and one of which Nathaniel had not touched. "She's good," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Marcus said. "She is." A pause. From outside the window, the sound of the city at mid-morning. Distant traffic, the low mechanical chord of Chicago moving through a Thursday. "You should know," Marcus said, "that I'm not planning to be difficult about this. The settlement figure is fair. The attribution matters to me more than the money, but both are fair." "All right," Nathaniel said, "and I'm not—" Marcus stopped, started again. "I don't have any interest in making this worse than it has to be for the company. That's not what this is about." Nathaniel looked at him. "What is it about?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was the same even register it always was, but there was something under it. Not heavy exactly, more like the truth had a specific weight when you let it out after a long time. "I needed a job. I'm good at the work I do. I just wanted to do work that was mine, that counted, and not have it feel like something I was doing around the edges of everything else." He paused. "That's the whole thing, I think." Nathaniel looked at the coffee he hadn't touched. Then he said, "I should have called you, in the months after. When you stopped answering, I should have called again, and I didn't, and the reason I didn't is because it was easier not to." Marcus looked at him, not with anger. The anger, if there had been any, had apparently been resolved somewhere in the past 8 years in the private, incremental way that people resolve things they can't afford to carry at full weight. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said. Marcus picked up his coffee. "I know that too," he said. They sat with that for a moment. The apology and the acknowledgement and the 8 years between them, which were not nothing and were also not, it turned out, everything. "The consulting contract," Marcus said. "You mentioned flexible terms. Whatever works for your schedule, remote primarily, on-site consultation when you want it." "I have a 9-year-old, Marcus said. "Her schedule is the constraint." "Understood. We'll write it around her school year." Marcus nodded. He drank the rest of his coffee. Then he looked out the window at the river, which was November gray and moving, and entirely unconcerned with anything happening in the conference room. "She's building a bridge," he said, "for her science project. She keeps calling me to ask questions I didn't think a 9-year-old would ask." "What kind of questions?" "Load distribution. How bridges handle dynamic stress versus static stress." He looked back at Nathaniel. "She's 9. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like her father." Something moved across Marcus's face then. Not a smile exactly, but the space where a smile lived, the place it came from. "Yeah," he said. "She does." On a Tuesday in mid-November, which was cold in the way November in Chicago is cold, committed and personal and not interested in compromise, Marcus Webb pulled up outside Lilly School at 3:16, 1 minute after the final bell, and watched the doors open and the third graders flood out into the afternoon in their various states of coat compliance and backpack organization. He had signed the agreement that morning. Sandra Park had been present. Nathaniel's general counsel had been present. The signing had taken 11 minutes, which was considerably less time than the framework itself had taken to build, which Marcus found fitting in some abstract way. Afterward, Sandra had shaken his hand and said, "Well done," and he had thanked her and driven to get lunch at Teresa's, alone, and sat in the red vinyl booth with a club sandwich and coffee, and the particular quiet of a man sitting in a place he knew and letting himself take up the space in it without apology. He was still taking that in carefully, the way you take in things that have been a long time coming, not all at once, but in increments, testing whether it was real. Lily came through the doors, wearing her purple backpack and the orange knit hat she'd refused to take off since October, and when she saw him, she didn't run. She was too old for running, apparently, but she walked faster. She pulled open the passenger door and climbed in, and threw her backpack in the back seat. "You're early," she said. "By 1 minute," he said. "You're usually exactly on time." "Today I'm early." She looked at him, the direct, assessing look. "Something happened." "Something happened," he agreed. She waited. "Good something," he said. She absorbed this with the careful precision of someone who wants to verify the category before allowing herself a reaction. "How good?" He thought about Sandra Park and the signed agreement and the attribution clause and the consulting contract and the figure that was going to change what February looked like, what next year looked like, what the next several years looked like in the specific material sense of what new school shoes and Mrs. Okafor's $40 and the lease in February looked like when they were not the things you counted against each other. "Pretty good," he said. Lily looked at him for one more second. Then she reached over and patted his arm once in the way she did when she had determined that something was settled and further discussion could wait, and turned to look out the window at the street moving past. "Can we go to Teresa's?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "We can go to Teresa's." He pulled out of the parking lot and into the flow of the street, into the city and the afternoon and the cold November light that was doing what it could, which was less than summer and more than nothing, which on most days was exactly enough.